I keep telling myself I should have spoken up earlier, but then again, maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. At 63 years old, I've come to believe that timing has its own kind of wisdom, even when it feels cruel. My name is Margaret Doyle, and for the past 4 years since my divorce was finalized, I've been learning how to take up space again. It's harder than it sounds. Before we continue, welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's get back to what happened next. When you spend decades making yourself smaller so someone else can feel larger, the habit becomes part of you. You stop noticing you're doing it, and you just keep shrinking until one day you look in the mirror and wonder where the woman you used to be has gone. I used to be someone who took chances. Back when I was 22 and fresh out of university in Halifax with a French literature degree and absolutely no sensible plan, I bought a one-way ticket to France. My mother thought I'd lost my mind, and my father said nothing, which in his language meant exactly the same thing. But I went anyway because something in me needed to discover what I was capable of when no one was watching. I ended up in Lyon rather than Paris, because Paris was for tourists and dreamers, while Lyon was where real French life happened messy, loud and extraordinary in all the best ways. I arrived intending to stay for 3 months, maybe improve my French, see some of the country, and then return home to find a respectable job. Instead, I stayed for 8 years. I learned the language the way people learn when survival depends on it. Not from textbooks or language apps, but from the woman at the morning market on Rue Auguste Comte, who sold me overripe peaches while correcting my grammar, and from the regulars at the Bouchon, where I worked during my first 2 years, men in their 60s who teased me relentlessly until my Lyonnais accent became more than acceptable. I didn't simply learn French. I learned its rhythm, its cadence, and the particular music of the way people spoke in Lyon quicker than Parisians, more clipped full of slang and shortcuts that no classroom could ever teach. Those years shaped me in ways I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Then I met Robert. He was a civil engineer from Hamilton, Ontario, working in Lyon on a consulting contract that was supposed to last 6 months. We met at a dreadful gallery opening I'd attended only because a colleague insisted. Robert was standing in front of a painting that looked as though someone had sneezed across a canvas when he turned to me and quietly said in English, "I have no idea what I'm looking at, and I suspect no one else does either." I laughed so hard the gallery owner glared at us. Robert extended his contract once then again, and when the time finally came for him to return to Canada, he asked me to come with him. I said yes. I packed up my little apartment near Vieux-Lyon and left behind the version of myself who was fluent adventurous and completely at home in a city that had once felt impossibly foreign. After that, I became Margaret Doyle wife first, then mother, then a suburban woman in Ontario whose greatest adventure involved discovering a good farmer's market on a Saturday morning. My French remained with me, but quietly. I read French novels, watched Quebecois television from time to time, and occasionally spoke French to myself while working in the garden, the way someone might hum a song from another chapter of their life, but I rarely mentioned it to anyone. It no longer seemed relevant, or at least that's what I told myself. Claire was born 2 years after Robert and I returned to Canada. She grew up knowing her mother had once lived in France, but it was one of those vague family facts children absorb without really thinking about, like knowing a grandparent came from another country. It sounded interesting in theory, but remained abstract in practice. She never asked many questions, and I never pushed the subject. So those years in Lyon gradually began to feel like something that had happened to another woman, someone braver and freer than the person I had become. The divorce arrived after 31 years of marriage. I won't say it was a surprise, because some things erode so slowly that you don't notice the damage until the structure is already compromised. Robert had been distant for years, and I had responded the way many Canadians do by staying polite, avoiding scenes, and quietly accepting less and less, until there was almost nothing left to accept. When he eventually told me he had met someone else, I remember thinking that the strangest part was how unsurprised I felt. By then, Claire was 30 years old and already established as a graphic designer in Toronto. She had been dating a structural engineer named Luca Beaumont for 2 years, a thoughtful, kind man with French-Belgian roots who had been born and raised in Brussels. I'd only met him twice before he proposed, but what mattered most was the way he looked at my daughter. There was genuine affection there, and that was enough for me. The engagement happened in February. By May, Luca's parents were flying in from Brussels to spend time with our family before the wedding. His mother, Hélène, and his father, Philippe, planned to spend a couple of weeks in Canada, beginning in Toronto, before joining all of us at a rented lakeside cottage near Huntsville for a family weekend. 3 weeks before the trip, Claire called me. "Mom, I really want this to go well. Hélène is lovely, but she's very particular. Philippe, too. They're proud people, proud of their family and where they come from. I just want everyone to feel comfortable." I assured her that I would do my best because I genuinely intended to. What I didn't tell her was that I was quietly terrified not of Hélène or Philippe, but of myself. 4 years after my divorce, living alone in a house in Guelph that often felt far too quiet, I had become deeply uncertain about how I appeared to other people. Robert had spent the final decade of our marriage making countless small remarks, never cruel enough to stand out individually, but constant enough to leave a mark. Over time, those comments convinced me that I was either too much or not enough, depending on the situation. You absorb that kind of thing eventually. It changes the way you move through the world without you realizing it. So when I packed my overnight bag and headed toward Huntsville on a warm Friday afternoon in late May, I wasn't worried about impressing Luca's parents. I was worried that somewhere along the way I had forgotten how to be fully myself. The cottage waiting beside the lake would end up reminding me that some parts of us never disappear at all. They simply wait for us to remember them. I arrived in Huntsville on a Friday afternoon near the end of May. The cottage Claire and Luca had rented sat right on the water, the kind of beautiful lakeside property that probably cost more for a weekend than many people spent on groceries in a month. They had chosen it because they wanted the gathering to feel special, and judging by the view alone, they had succeeded. When I pulled into the driveway, Luca was already there, and Claire was moving between the kitchen and the deck, looking equal parts busy and happy. Hélène and Philippe had arrived about an hour before me. As I lifted my overnight bag from the trunk, Hélène came outside to greet me. She was tall, impeccably dressed, even for a cottage weekend, wearing pressed linen trousers, a pale gray silk blouse, and understated silver jewelry that somehow managed to look both simple and expensive. She greeted me with European air kisses on both cheeks and said in lightly accented English, "Margaret, we've heard so much about you. Welcome." Her smile was pleasant, but there was something practiced about it, a warmth that existed more out of courtesy than genuine familiarity. Philippe shook my hand firmly a moment later. He was silver-haired and distinguished, the kind of man who looked as though he had strong opinions about wine and felt no need to keep them to himself. He said something polite, gestured toward the cottage, and somehow managed to make me feel like a guest in a gathering organized by my own daughter. We spent the next hour on the deck with drinks while the sun slowly lowered over the lake. The water reflected shades of copper and gold, and under different circumstances I would have found the entire scene peaceful. Instead, I sat slightly apart from the center of the conversation, holding a glass of Ontario Riesling and listening as discussions flowed naturally around me. Luca's parents spoke English well, but every so often they slipped into French when speaking to each other or to Luca. It wasn't unusual. People naturally return to their first language when they're with those who share it. I understood that perfectly. I also understood every word they were saying. Neither of them had the slightest reason to suspect that. The first exchange happened while Claire stepped inside to check on dinner, and Luca went to refill everyone's drinks. Hélène glanced around the property and remarked in French that the cottage was charming, although perhaps a little rustic for her tastes. Philippe agreed and added that Canadians seemed unusually fond of that sort of thing, treating nature as a substitute for culture. The comment wasn't especially cruel. Dismissive, certainly, but not cruel. It sounded like the sort of observation people make when they believe they're speaking privately. I took a sip of wine and kept my expression neutral. A few minutes later, Luca returned, carrying fresh drinks. Hélène touched his arm, and still speaking French told him that Claire seemed sweet. She added that Claire's tastes were perhaps a little simple, but she appeared good-natured, and that what mattered most was whether she made him happy. Luca immediately replied that Claire absolutely made him happy, and that he would appreciate it if his mother didn't describe the woman he intended to marry as simple. Hélène waved away the objection. "I meant it as a compliment," she said. "Simple is honest. Simple is pure." I kept my face perfectly still. Years earlier, I might have reacted. I might have stiffened or looked offended. Instead, I sat quietly and listened, because there was a strange advantage in being underestimated. People reveal far more about themselves when they believe no one is paying attention. Eventually, Claire returned, dinner was ready, and we moved inside. The seating arrangement formed naturally, placing me at one end of the table near Philippe, while Hélène sat closer to Claire and Luca. The atmosphere remained pleasant on the surface. Claire had spent weeks practicing a boeuf bourguignon recipe, and the result was genuinely excellent. Philippe complimented the meal warmly in English before turning toward me. "So Margaret Claire mentioned you recently retired." I nodded. I explained that I had spent 22 years teaching English at a private secondary school before deciding it was time for a quieter pace of life. Philippe listened politely, but his interest seemed limited. He gave the sort of nod people offer when they have already decided a topic isn't especially important. Then he turned slightly toward Hélène and said something in French. His voice was lower than before, but not low enough. He remarked that he understood now why Claire seemed somewhat unpolished. Her mother appeared kind, certainly, but not like someone who had experienced much of the world. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. Hélène responded that she didn't mean that as criticism. Many people lived small, quiet lives and were perfectly happy doing so. Not everyone possessed ambition, curiosity, or the desire to build something beyond the ordinary. She delivered the observation gently, as though commenting on someone's preference for plain furniture, rather than passing judgment on an entire life. Across the table, Claire looked up briefly. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere. "Everything okay down there?" she asked. "Wonderful," I replied with a smile. "The wine is lovely." Then I lifted my glass. My hand remained perfectly steady, and I was quietly proud of that. Philippe refilled his wine glass and settled back in his chair. The conversation around the table continued smoothly enough on the surface, but I could feel something changing beneath it. The comments that had begun as casual observations were becoming more pointed, more confident, as both he and Hélène grew increasingly comfortable with the assumption that they could speak freely without being understood. Then Philippe turned toward Hélène and remarked in French that he hoped Luca wouldn't spend his married life carrying the weight of a wife who lacked real roots or a strong cultural foundation. He said he wanted future grandchildren who understood where they came from and who possessed a deeper connection to history, language, and tradition. I looked at him across the table. He wasn't looking at me. Neither of them were. They were speaking to each other with the relaxed certainty of people who believed they were alone inside their own conversation. Claire and Luca, meanwhile, were discussing wedding details at the opposite end of the table, completely unaware of what was unfolding. A few minutes later, Claire excused herself to bring out dessert, and Luca followed her into the kitchen to help carry plates and coffee. The moment they disappeared, Philippe continued speaking. He was in the middle of another observation about the importance of family foundations when I finally decided I had listened long enough. In French, using the unmistakable accent of someone who had spent years living in Lyon rather than Brussels, I said calmly, "I think, Philippe, that you may be underestimating the value of roots that aren't immediately visible." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that seems to alter the air itself. Philippe's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Hélène slowly turned her head toward me. Neither of them moved for several seconds as they tried to process what they had just heard. I simply met their gaze and waited. Eventually, Philippe spoke. "You speak French, I do," I replied. Another pause followed. Then I added, "I lived in Lyon for 8 years. I learned the language there, not from textbooks." The shock on their faces was almost painful to watch. For the first time all evening, they looked genuinely uncertain. Helene found her voice first. "How much did you understand?" she asked quietly. "Everything," I answered gently without anger. From the comments about the cottage being rustic, to the observations about Claire being simple, to the concern that your son might be marrying a woman without sufficient cultural depth. All of it. Neither of them spoke. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were distant voices from the kitchen and the faint clink of dishes being arranged for dessert. I folded my hands together on the table. "I want you to know that I'm not angry," I said. "People often speak more honestly when they believe they're speaking privately. I've probably done the same thing myself at different points in my life. But before Claire comes back, I think there are a few things that need to be said." My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it against my ribs, yet my voice remained surprisingly steady. "My daughter is not simple," I continued. "She is direct. Those are very different things, and I think it's important not to confuse them." Helene lowered her eyes. I went on. "Claire says what she means because she was raised to believe that honesty is a form of respect. She is curious, thoughtful, and hardworking. She reads, constantly teaches herself new skills, simply because she wants to understand how things work and approaches people with genuine kindness. The fact that she doesn't perform sophistication in the way you might be accustomed to doesn't mean sophistication isn't there." Philippe opened his mouth as though he intended to respond. I raised one hand politely. "Please let me finish." To his credit, he immediately nodded. "I spent many years living a quiet life," I said. "I was a wife. Then I was a mother. Then I was a teacher. I devoted myself to those roles because they mattered to me. But before all of that, I was 22 years old and living alone in France with very little money and absolutely no guarantee that anything would work out." The room remained completely still. "I know Lyon the way you know Brussels. I know its streets, its neighborhoods, its markets, and the way the city feels when November settles over the rooftops. I worked in restaurants where my French was terrible, and then spent years making it better. I built a life there from nothing. I left because I fell in love, and I stayed away because I was raising a family." I paused briefly before continuing. Over time, that chapter of my life became quieter. Not because it stopped mattering, but because other responsibilities took its place. I lifted my wine glass and took a small sip. "I'm not telling you any of this to impress you. I'm telling you because you formed very strong opinions about both me and my daughter after only a few hours. Those opinions are incomplete." Neither Philippe nor Hélène interrupted. For the first time since arriving at the cottage, they were listening without judgment. "Your son loves a woman who is honest, capable, hardworking, and kind. Those qualities are not signs of simplicity. They are signs of character. They're also much rarer than people often realize." Outside the kitchen, I could hear Claire laughing. Luca said something in response, and she laughed again. It was the same laugh she had as a little girl, completely genuine and entirely unguarded. The sound seemed to hang in the air between us. Finally, Philippe lowered his glass onto the table. Something in his expression had changed. The careful assessment he'd worn all evening was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably close to humility. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "We have not been entirely kind." "No," I agreed calmly. "You haven't." For a long moment, nobody said anything else. Then Hélène pressed both hands flat against the table and looked directly at me. "Margaret," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." And for the first time that evening, I believed she meant it. For a moment, none of us moved. The tension that had dominated the evening hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt hostile. Instead, it had become something far more uncomfortable and far more valuable: honesty. Hélène remained seated with her hands resting on the table, while Philippe looked down at his wine glass as though reconsidering everything he had assumed about me during the previous several hours. Then Hélène spoke again. 8 years in Lyon, she asked, still in French. Really, I replied. A faint smile touched my face despite myself. I spent my first 2 years waiting tables at a bouchon near the Préquille before I eventually found the teaching position I wanted. The owner was a man named Georges, who informed me during my first week that my French was appalling. By the third month, he upgraded it to passable, and by Christmas, he considered it acceptable. That was about as generous as he ever became. Something shifted in Felipe's expression. For the first time all evening, he smiled. Not politely, not diplomatically, genuinely. Georges, who he asked. I told him the name of the restaurant. His eyebrows immediately rose. We stopped there every time we passed through Lyon during the 90s, he said. Georges was impossible. A brilliant cook, Hélène added. And a terrible human being, Philippe said. I laughed. He once told me my pronunciation of half the French language was an insult to the Republic. Philippe pointed at me. He told Hélène that her pronunciation of coq au vin was an insult to Burgundy. The three of us actually laughed. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened earlier, but it changed the atmosphere completely. Instead of sitting across from one another as strangers making assumptions, we were suddenly sharing memories connected to the same city, the same streets, and even some of the same people. A few moments later, Claire and Luca returned carrying dessert plates. Claire immediately slowed. Children never really stop being children when it comes to reading their parents. Even at 30 years old, she could tell something significant had happened while she was gone. She looked from me to Philippe and then to Hélène. Everything okay? Yes, Hélène replied. The difference in her tone was unmistakable. The practiced politeness from earlier had disappeared. Your mother was just telling us about Lyon. Claire blinked. My mother's what? Her years in Lyon, Philippe said. Claire stared at me. My mother speaks French. I smiled. A little, she repeated. Mom, I thought you studied there. I didn't know you actually spoke French, fluently Philippe corrected, and with a very respectable Lyonnais accent. Claire slowly sat down. The expression on her face was somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Mom, I laughed softly. I know. No, seriously. How did I not know this? That is an excellent question. The table grew quiet again, though this silence felt entirely different from the one before. Claire leaned forward. Why didn't you ever tell me? Unlike many questions people ask during family gatherings, this one deserved an honest answer. I considered it carefully. Because after your father and I divorced, I put a lot of things away, I said. Not physically, emotionally. Claire listened without interrupting. The years in France belonged to a version of me that felt very far away. She was adventurous and confident and willing to take risks. As time passed, it became easier to think of her as someone separate from the person I had become. I paused. Eventually, talking about those years started to feel like talking about someone else's life. Claire frowned. But it was your life. Yes, I said quietly. It was. The truth of that settled heavily between us. For years, I had spoken about my life in fragments, presenting only the parts that seemed relevant to the present. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that the rest no longer mattered. Looking at my daughter now, I realized how much of myself I had hidden. After the divorce, I think I made a mistake. I continued. I spent so much time trying not to be difficult, not to draw attention to myself, and not to seem self-important that I gradually made myself smaller. Eventually, I became so accustomed to being small that I forgot I had any choice in the matter. Claire reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Across from us, Hélène turned toward Philippe and said something quietly in French. This time I understood every word, and this time I chose not to translate them. It was an apology between husband and wife, an acknowledgement of the assumptions they had made and the conclusions they had rushed toward. Unlike the earlier comments, these words weren't intended for anyone else. Some conversations deserve privacy. The evening continued from there with a completely different energy. After dessert, Philippe asked me about Lyon's old quarter, and what began as a simple question turned into nearly an hour of conversation. We talked about the traboules hidden between buildings, the markets, the cafes, and the subtle ways Lyon differed from Paris, despite sharing the same language. Helene told stories about Brussels, about the neighborhood where Luca grew up, and about a bakery that had stood on the same corner for 4 decades before finally closing during the pandemic. Claire and Luca sat listening with expressions of growing astonishment. It must have felt strange for them. They had always known these pieces of their parents separately, but now they were hearing them speak to one another as equals, sharing experiences from lives that existed long before either of them had entered the picture. As the fire crackled softly in the background and the lake darkened beyond the windows, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I wasn't proving anything. For the first time in years, I was simply allowing myself to be seen, and that felt far more important than winning any argument ever could. Later that evening, after Luca stepped outside to bring in more wood for the fireplace, and Philippe wandered onto the deck for a few minutes of fresh air, Helene came and sat beside me on the couch. The cottage had settled into that comfortable stage of the night when conversations become quieter and people stop trying to make impressions. Through the large windows, the lake reflected the last traces of moonlight, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. Finally, she turned toward me. "I want to say something properly," she said in English. "Not politely. Properly." I nodded. What I said about Claire was unfair. It was also unkind. I told myself it was acceptable because I was speaking privately with Philippe, but the fact that I didn't intend for anyone else to hear it doesn't actually change what I said. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no attempt to soften responsibility, just honesty. "She is clearly a remarkable woman," Helene continued. "I made judgments before I understood who she was. I do that sometimes when I'm nervous. It isn't one of my better qualities. Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I mean it." "I know." For a moment she looked toward the lake again. "Luca loves her," she said quietly. "I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at Claire." A smile appeared on my face. "Neither have I." "And if she has inherited even half of her mother's character, then our family is gaining something very special." For several seconds, I wasn't entirely sure what to say. The compliment touched something deeper than I expected. Not because I needed validation from Helene, but because for so many years I had stopped seeing myself clearly. When someone spends enough time becoming invisible, even kindness can feel surprising. Then Helene asked the question I suspected had been sitting in her mind all evening. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I laughed softly. "That's a very fair question. You understood everything from the beginning. Most of it. You could have stopped us long before dinner." I considered that carefully. Partly because I was trying to be polite, I admitted. Canadians have a tendency to endure things longer than we probably should. That earned a genuine laugh from her. But that isn't the whole answer. "No," I shook my head. "For the last 4 years, I've been letting a lot of things pass without comment. Ever since my divorce, I've spent an incredible amount of energy worrying about being too much, too outspoken, too demanding, too opinionated, too visible." The words came more easily than I expected, perhaps because I had been carrying them for so long. Eventually, I became so concerned about taking up too much space that I started taking up almost none at all. Helene listened quietly. "I spent years shrinking myself," I continued. "Not deliberately. It happened gradually. I stopped mentioning parts of my life. I stopped talking about accomplishments that mattered to me. I stopped expressing opinions unless someone specifically asked. At some point, I convinced myself that modesty and invisibility were the same thing." The room remained silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. "I'm 63 years old," I said. "I've lived in France. I've raised a remarkable daughter. I've survived a difficult marriage with my sense of humor mostly intact. I think I've finally reached the point where I'm tired of apologizing for existing." For a few moments, Helene said nothing. Then she smiled. "My grandmother used to say something. Oh, it doesn't translate perfectly into English." "Those are usually the best sayings." She laughed softly. "Very true. Roughly translated, it means a woman who makes herself invisible to keep the peace has surrendered the only thing that truly belonged to her." The words settled over us. I looked out toward the lake. "Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked." She was terrifying, Helene said immediately. That startled a laugh out of me. But she was usually right. A few seconds later, she added, "Actually, now that I think about it, you remind me a little of her." Before I could respond, the cottage door opened and Philippe stepped back inside. He glanced between the two of us and instantly recognized that he had interrupted a conversation that wasn't intended for him. Wisely, he made no attempt to inquire further and headed directly toward the kitchen in search of whiskey. The rest of the evening unfolded slowly, the way genuinely good evenings often do. Claire made tea. Luca discovered a card game none of us knew particularly well. We spent the next hour learning the rules badly and breaking them accidentally while the fire burned lower and lower. The laughter came more easily now, and the awkwardness that had shadowed the beginning of the weekend gradually disappeared. At one point, I looked across the table and caught Claire watching me. There was an expression on her face I hadn't seen in years. Part pride, part surprise, part wonder. It reminded me of the way she used to look at me when she was 8 years old and discovered something unexpected about the world. For the first time all weekend, I realized she wasn't just seeing the mother she had always known. She was seeing the woman who had existed before that. And somehow after all these years, I was finally seeing her too. The next morning arrived wrapped in soft sunlight and the quiet stillness that only seems to exist beside a lake. I woke earlier than everyone else and carried a mug of coffee out onto the deck. The water was perfectly calm, reflecting the pale colors of the sky, and for a while I simply sat there enjoying the silence. It felt different from the silence I had known after my divorce. That silence had felt empty. This one felt peaceful. By the time the others woke up, the cottage had settled into the comfortable rhythm that often follows an unexpectedly honest conversation. Breakfast stretched longer than anyone planned. Coffee was poured repeatedly, plans for the wedding resurfaced, and nobody seemed eager to rush toward departures. When it was finally time to leave, Luca walked me out to my car. For a moment, we stood together near the driveway looking out at the lake. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For what?" "For last night. For what you said about Claire." I smiled. She didn't need me to defend her. "I know," he said. "She would have defended herself perfectly well if she'd known what was being said." "Exactly." But still, he continued, "It mattered." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and looked toward the water. "My parents are good people," he said. "Sometimes they just need someone to open a door before they can see what's on the other side." I thought about that. Then I smiled. "Your mother opened that door herself." I merely knocked. Luca laughed, and I found myself liking the sound of it. The drive home was pleasant. Traffic thinned steadily after Barry, and the highway felt unusually calm for a Saturday morning. My phone sat in the cup holder, lighting up with notifications every few minutes. The first messages came from Claire. They started with accusations. Not serious accusations, of course. The affectionate kind. "Mom, you've been hiding this from me for 30 years. A few minutes later came another. "You speak French?" Then another, followed by a voice memo containing her attempt to say a French sentence she had clearly looked up online. The pronunciation was catastrophically wrong. I laughed so hard I nearly missed my exit. The next message came from Philippe. It arrived by email rather than text, which somehow suited him perfectly. The note was formal, thoughtful, and deeply sincere. He apologized properly for the assumptions he and Elaine had made and thanked me for extending them more grace than they had earned. Near the end of the message, he included the name of a restaurant in Lyon that had recently opened in the old Tanner's Quarter and suggested I visit it someday, if I ever found myself back in France. The final message came from Hélène. It was written entirely in French, short, direct, very much like her. "We would like you to come to Brussels before the wedding. Luca's grandmother is 91 and no longer travels. She should meet you. I think the two of you would have much to discuss. Please consider it." I pulled into a Tim Hortons parking lot outside Barrie and read the message twice while my coffee slowly cooled beside me. Then I sat there for a while thinking about a 22-year-old woman with a one-way ticket to France and no sensible plan. I thought about Lyon, about the market on Rue Auguste Comte. about the bouchon where Georges had informed me that my French was an offense against the entire nation before eventually deciding I was worth introducing to customers. I thought about the young woman who had crossed an ocean alone because she wanted to discover what she was capable of. For 4 years after my divorce, I had convinced myself that woman no longer existed. I had spent so much time trying to disappear gracefully that I forgot she had ever been real. But she had been real, and she still was. She had simply been waiting patiently for me to stop pretending otherwise. I opened my phone and replied to Hélène in French. I told her I would be delighted to visit Brussels before the wedding, and that I would very much like to meet Luca's grandmother. I also admitted that I hadn't been back to Europe in more than 30 years and asked whether she had recommendations for places to stay. Her response arrived less than 3 minutes later. It contained a ranked list of 3 hotels, along with highly specific notes about the strengths and weaknesses of each. I laughed out loud in the middle of the parking lot. A man carrying a box of Timbits glanced over at me in surprise. I didn't care. For another minute, I sat there smiling at my phone and thinking about how strange life can be. Sometimes the parts of ourselves we miss most aren't actually gone. They've simply been buried beneath years of responsibility, compromise, and self-doubt. Eventually, I finished my coffee and started the car. I had a passport to renew. I had a suitcase to find. And I had a daughter who had suddenly decided that her mother was responsible for teaching her enough French to survive a wedding surrounded by Belgian relatives. That alone was likely to require months of patience. I was already looking forward to it. I often tell myself I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe that's true. But I've come to believe that sooner wasn't something I was ready for. I needed those 4 quiet years after my divorce. I needed a cottage beside a lake in Muskoka. I needed 2 Belgian strangers who had no idea I understood every word they were saying. Most of all, I needed one evening that forced me to remember something I had spent far too long forgetting. I'm still here. I have always been here, and I am not nearly as small as I once convinced myself I was. Looking back now, I don't think the most important thing that happened that weekend was that Hélène and Philippe discovered I spoke French. The important thing was that I finally remembered who I was before I spent years convincing myself to become smaller for everyone else's comfort. For a long time, I believed that humility meant staying quiet, that kindness meant making room for everyone else, and that peace was something you earned by asking for less. Somewhere along the way, I stopped sharing parts of myself because they seemed unnecessary, and eventually, I stopped seeing their value altogether. The woman who crossed an ocean alone at 22, built a life in a foreign country, and learned a language from scratch, never disappeared. She simply got buried beneath decades of responsibility routine and self-doubt. What surprised me most was how quickly things changed once I stopped hiding. Not because other people suddenly saw me differently, but because I did. The moment I stopped apologizing for taking up space, I realized that confidence isn't something you find. It's something you remember. These days, when I think about Lion Brussels Claire's wedding, or that evening beside the lake, I don't remember the embarrassment or the assumptions that were made. I remember the conversation that followed. I remember the honesty. I remember looking at my daughter and realizing that she wasn't the only one growing into herself. At 63, I thought I was learning how to live alone. What I was really learning was how to come back to myself. And after all these years, that turned out to be the most important journey of all.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.